Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Silk Narratives podcast. My guest for today is Tamara Chalabi, a cultural entrepreneur, a New York Times critically acclaimed author, curator, and commissioner who specializes in contemporary Middle Eastern art. Apart from her captivating memoir, Late for Tea at the Deer Palace, the Harvard trained historian is also the co founder of Ruya Foundation, an NGO that focuses on enriching contemporary culture both within Iraq and internationally. Ruya runs an extensive program of art activities in the refugee camps of northern Iraq, manages the only publicly accessible online database of contemporary Iraqi artists, and is the commissioner for the National Pavilion of Iraq at the Venice Biennale since 2013. Chalabi's work has been nominated for and received several awards. In 2013, she was also nominated one of Foreign Policy magazine's 100 Global Thinkers for her work on the Welcome to Iraq exhibition. Tamara, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Tamara, it's really a pleasure to have you. And usually, when I start to present my guests, I focus on their achievements, what they have done so far, but away from achievements, away from titles. Who is Tamara?
Uh, well, I would say I'm a human being. I'm a global citizen. That's a female in this lifetime. I'm a human being. I think that's the most important element. I think we often, in the world we live in, we tend to forget that very fundamental reality.
So, Tamara, I got to know you through your book, Late for Tea at the Deer Palace, which could be described as a literary tour de force. It's a memoir about your family through the first half of the 20th century. It captures that golden era of Iraq before things started to fall apart. How would you describe it to someone who hasn't read it?
Well, thank you for calling it a tour de force. I don't know that it is, but it's definitely a very earnest and sincere and very serious attempt on my part to, if you like, pay homage to my inheritance, at least on a kind of a human historical social level. I think one of the things that I found very challenging in confronting Iraq and Baghdad for the very first time, which was in 2003, was the complete disconnect and the dissonance between what I grew up listening and hearing from my family and what had driven so many to, this longing and this nostalgia for a certain era that you mentioned, and what I saw. And I think the only way for me to make sense of it was to basically try to recreate it, to understand how it came about and how it maybe vanished, if you like. And so it is a work of excavation, in fact, of kind of archaeology of the mind, of memory, of a collective. But it's also very much the story of Iraq. So it's about trying to give access to a reader about a country through individuals, which I think always makes it much more engaging than just dry historical text.
No, exactly. And actually, when you look at the book, it doesn't feel like the fruit of hazard. It is really a labor of love. It feels, at least to the reader, like a masterpiece that you've worked on for a long time, that you've put a lot of effort into, a lot of research into. How was the journey to writing it?
It was mixed. It was fraught. It was lonely. It was at many times, problematic in the sense that that attempt to mix the personal with the public is there is no guidebook for it. And so, there were certain moments that seemed so impossible to put down on paper and to recreate, if you like, and others that were just that flowed so quickly. I spent a lot of time interviewing people. In addition to obviously reading books and doing all the other like sort of library kind research. But the interviewing of people was a very interesting experience in and of itself. And in many cases, I would interview the same person maybe twice, if not three times, and it's fascinating to see, especially when people are of a certain age, because and they're remembering how vivid their childhood comes to life. And so the actual interviewing process for me was a very interesting one. And I really tried to be as diverse as possible. So I went across the range of, certainly with a period of pre-58, to interview as many kinds of people as possible. So like from the uber royalists to the communists to obviously members of my family to members of the Iraqi Jewish community that, you know, were very prominent before, to different kinds of people, and, you know, discussing costumes, eating habits, you name it. I mean, it just, you know, went on and on. But obviously the most, I would say, connected, or like the most kind of essential part, was to really be interviewing a lot of the members of my family, of the older generations. And that was a real challenge in many ways, because you um, you know, you have to maintain a certain kind of objectivity, but at the same time things become very emotional. And so like when you're trying to retell someone's story, how do you maintain that balance, and how do you, so there were lots of things, lots of challenges. I remember, for example, that the chapter on the revolution, when I did write it, and I remember I found it very, very difficult to write, because it was extremely emotional, and the memories and the trauma that was communicated through the various individuals who recalled it firsthand, you know, whether in the kind of the fear, the arrests, etc., the, you know, complete chaos. I mean, I really felt that I had, like, that was transmitted to me almost like at a, you know, in an osmosis kind of way, like at a telepathic level. I mean, beyond listening to it, that I really found it difficult to write. And then when I did write it, it was a big relief. So, I mean, it was interesting. There were lots of different moments that were, yeah, I mean, it's not a straightforward story of just like, you know, sitting and writing.
No, absolutely not. And for someone who hasn't read the book, so basically, Tamara really focuses on her family, which was the Chalabi family, which was prominent at the time of the king in Iraq during the monarchy. So we get to see a glimpse of that Iraq during the first half of the 20th century. We get to see what their daily life looked like, the culture, the rituals, the nature of the relations between family members, the Iraqi society and all of its complexities. But at the same time, we also get to understand what is essentially Baghdadi, what is essentially Iraqi, through the description of marriage rituals, through the description of certain traditions and events that still set us apart, even for those of us who have never lived in Iraq. I've had Zina Saeed also on this show. It was one of the first episodes. And for some Iraqis, the memory of the revolution, or what we heard about it, it's very painful, because you don't want to be associated with such a brutal history. And you don't want to be represented by what followed that. So it's very difficult, especially to see that we were doing so well before, that the country was, you know, blossoming, that we were going somewhere, and it was interrupted abruptly. And this is something that I found also very painful when I was studying it, when I was reading about it and going back to my parents and asking them all of these questions, and the why and the tears. And I can only imagine what it's like when your family's directly connected to that change. It must also feel quite heavy. And that's something you mentioned the other day. You said being Iraqi, carrying an Iraqi identity is very heavy.
I don't know that it's the same for everybody, but I mean, it's exactly, you coined it. I mean, I remember when I was a child, and I have to emphasize here that my Iraqi identity is also negotiated. My mom's Lebanese. I was born in Beirut. I completely identified as a child being, you know, Lebanese. The only kind of thing that was a little bit different is when I would go to my Iraqi grandparents' house, and my bibi would, you know, speak in a different way, and I would eat different food. But you know, you don't think about it so much in those terms. But then there was a point when everything was brutally interrupted, of course, because there was a Lebanese civil war, and suddenly what we were was more relevant, prominent, the kind of the passport, suddenly you couldn't, everything became a problem because of this connection with this place, and then of course this big name that like started appearing, like, and I think I write it in the book, like, even the sound of the word, Saddam. I'm talking as a child, so like Saddam. It actually was like this very, heavy word, very like, it's like, the big bad wolf kind of thing. And it just, and I think, as you were saying, like, I really, like for a lot of people, like, where are you from? They just say where they're from. It's not political. It's from a geography. But I could never comfortably say I am from Iraq, because automatically that in my mind was this brutal regime. So for me, it was just, it was heavy just on a basic level. Like, you'd be walking in the street and like, where, whatever, you'd meet someone, and it wasn't a simple, oh, I'm from here, and then moving on. Like, it never was simple.
I think that we should come up with a new slogan. You are not your regime.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, even though we got rid of that, looking at the human rights violations that are happening on a daily basis in Iraq today, it doesn't make it easier to be a proud Iraqi.
The heaviness doesn't stop. I mean, it's a kind of constant negotiation with pain at a certain level, and I think how you become more philosophical about it. And it always carries a lot of emotions. I mean, I on so many levels, and I think it's also this idea of the fact that, this blip in time, in this moment in time when we, the golden era that we kind of, like, I think had like gave so much inspiration maybe to a lot of people, and this longing is just that. It was, maybe that was the blip in time. I don't know. I mean, you look at people today and you want to find something to connect with, and there are traces constantly. And I mean, I'm very how do I put it? I'm very eclectic as an individual. I mean, one of the things that I loved about, at least the stories that I heard about the idea of being Iraqi, for me was really this kind of, complete confetti of ethnicities and languages, and which doesn't fit into a certain idea of, like an Arab Iraq necessarily. Like, it didn't mean, I love the fact that, and everybody has these crazy names, like, like I don't know, Muhammad Matbakh or Haidar Tarzi, or, all these, like, I mean, it's actually a very creative language, the Iraqi dialect. And I loved how you had this mixture of Turkish and Kurdish and Persian and God knows what, just all. And and that actually something that is very alive today. And so for me today, for example, I find it hilarious when I hear about the way that they've adapted, certainly, like, tech terms. "هاي ما مفرمتة," يعني, this is not a formatted file.
Yeah.
Or connect, which is, did you connect to, I mean, I find this very charming. It's there's something very, I mean, it probably not only Iraqi. I mean, I know that everybody has their own thing, but I just find the Iraqi one particularly entertaining, so to speak. And and for me, this place was always a place of diversity. And I say that in absolute, like, of genuineness. I mean, and so, and it was a point of pride. That was one connection I had. I mean, in fact, to be honest with you, the way I started to learn about Iraq as a teenager was through the Kurdish story, because I was in boarding school here in England, and then you saw all these mass exodus of the Kurds through the mountains. It just gave an additional richness to this place. It wasn't just like your template, simple Arab country with its just, like, there was so much to it, so many layers. Yes. It is so unbelievably rich. And I'm a glutton for diversity, if you like. I find this really, really such a point of strength. I mean, for example, this last weekend, there was a big commemoration of the Mullah Mustafa Barzani Memorial in Barzan in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan. And I mean, and a lot of people were there. I mean, it was a special event, and it was all of the kind of friends of Mullah Mustafa, of which my father was a very dear friend and of the Kurdish cause in general, etc. Many people were there, including a lot of people from Baghdad and elsewhere. And then you go out and there's a beautiful, the ceremony was, I found, very moving and emotional, just at the level of preserving that memory, that identity that is, problematic maybe in a political sense for a country, but like for their own trace of survival, of being. And I have such profound respect for the fact that they have done this, and that that there is a recording of their struggle, of their history, of their story. I just stood there and it was like this incredibly beautiful space, incredibly haunting, extremely sad, but so beautiful. And there was such a kind of a spirituality to it because of the nature around, and because of this just very respectful commemoration. And so this for me has very personal connotations that go beyond the fact of whether I'm ethnically, Kurdish or not, or whatever. I mean, they're also part of the story of what we all lived through, certainly in a moment of profound shame when, you saw those pictures of let's say, the mass graves or the chemical weapons being used at the time. So that's a memory that I carry, but it doesn't take away anything that has been inflicted since. But it's a very different, how do you weigh, how do you kind of prioritize or categorize this in never-ending culture of violence that just keeps going and going. I mean, I had a very painful, I remember it so well, which is August 2nd, 3rd, 2014, when ISIS went in, and when I saw those images. I couldn't sleep for I found it was just like so primitive. It felt like something out of the Middle Ages, which it really was. Or looking at these disgusting, shots of these men like destroying the monuments in Mosul Museum. Like, to me, people mourn the loss of human life, and as one should. But to me, that was also a murder. You're murdering your past, your history, your identity. So I found there's so many things that the litany of abuses that have been inflicted by every community in Iraq today. So the way I think about it is that, maybe everybody is equally criminal, and, nobody's a victim anymore. Then maybe then we can, have a different conversation. But
I don't know what you think about this, and this was not planned as part of this conversation, but I truly believe that the destruction of Iraq has happened from within and from without. It has also happened. It was, the more you read, the more you understand that it was in no one's interest to see a strong Iraq coming about. And I think that also explains the series of tyrants that we have been witnessing over the years, and the never-ending cycle of violence that keeps on continuing. But yeah, it's extremely sad to say the least.
It is sad. It is heartbreaking. It's more than heartbreaking because, I have a certain view of things, which, is not necessarily a standard or popular amongst many. I think Iraq was on a really, really interesting path leading up to 58, and it took one wrong turn, and then that wrong turn took, and obviously it wasn't felt immediately because, the benefits of all the reforms and everything that took place prior to 58 lasted, I would say, well into, there was a strong foundation, which kind of like, still kind of had echoes of it into the 70s. And then, it's all been a series of wrong turns. So there's a lot of things, but above and beyond all of the external factors, which are not to be underestimated by any stretch of the imagination, is, and what I do hold accountable is the local agency, Iraqi responsibility. So from my perspective, I care a lot more about Iraqis becoming better people and Iraq becoming a better society, and that responsibility ultimately is an Iraqi one. And this is not to excuse any external anything at all. But when I look at Iraq over the last 20 years and how things have developed and and how society has developed, and how and I mean this is not unique to Iraq, but I'm speaking about Iraq in terms of the complete evaporation, if there was one that we assumed existed, of any kind of moral compass. So that we talk about corruption in terms of the on a government level, on financial corruption, so to speak, and Iraq is kind of like, I think one of the highest. It's sort of, I don't know if it's like superseded Nigeria today or not, but there is, people don't really seem to understand that corruption is in everyday life. It's in, people are corrupt without knowing they're corrupt. That's how
Yeah,
profound corruption has become.
the corruption is excused. They excuse it for themselves.
Yes, because it's, because somehow, wealth and power are the only things that matter. That's it. And so, the way to survive is by perpetuating both, and one perpetuates the other. I mean, you can buy power through wealth, you can make wealth through power. I mean, and it's become a template. So, in Iraq today, the average person comes to you and tells you, please help me, I want to get appointed. أريد أتعين. Not I want a job. It's very different.
It's true.
So to be appointed, it's meaning you just go and you get a salary. أريد راتب. Doesn't mean أريد أشتغل. They're very different. I would say I'm much less generous in my sort of description of people's victimhood than I used to be, for these reasons, because I think you can get out of that. It's also a choice on an individual level. I mean, and individuals make up collectives, and collectives make up society. I think there are many things that can be done individually.
Just the last point on this before moving on to things that are a little bit lighter, a little bit nicer, a little bit better for the soul. Iraq is also, I mean, after Sykes-Picot, what happened is that you have like these young governments that have been designed from the outside, and they have been, how do I say this, directed a little bit, guided from the outside. So I think it's also important to know that there is an element of fragility there. And in the case of Iraq, it's not just fragility, it's fragility juxtaposed with complexity, because you have the social fabric is extremely complex. And of course, you could be smart enough and see it as a source of richness.
It is.
Or
it's so special.
For people like you and me, we see it as richness. I love that my son gets to hear Arabic and Kurdish, and that's Iraqi for me,
Yeah.
But you can also see it as a source of division. So that's the issue that we have, and it's a huge one. But anyways, as I said, let's move to happier, nicer things. One thing that I truly loved about your book is the title, Late for Tea at the Deer Palace. For me as an Iraqi, if you would tell me what it is that you consider Iraqi, I don't want to think about wars, and I don't want to think about tyrants, and I don't want to think of any of this. I would think of tea time and the sanctity of tea time and all the conversations that happen around tea time and the joy of tea time, which I honestly have, although I've never even lived a day in Baghdad. And my parents still say, that you love tea time so much. Why this title?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think it's what you said. I mean, everywhere you go, you're offered chai, chai, and it's really chai, which I love as a thing. I love the ritual of it. I mean, obviously, it's not exclusively Iraqi. You have it in Turkey, you have it in Iran. I mean, the tea is obviously in an istikan, and I mean, and a glass plate. It's all made. It's glass. Don't ever give me tea in a mug. Sort of somehow everything gets resolved around tea. You offer tea, chai, it's such a, and I love the ritual of it. I mean, which is obviously, it's not just boiling tea and, it's like these two pots. I mean, there's a whole, ritual around it, which I think is wonderful. And the fact that you can control the strength of the tea and so on and so forth. So this is, I mean, separately, this is sort of also my personal thing. I collect teapots. I love teapots. I love things that are round, and I just think it's really interesting. And I really like particularly teapots coming out of the ex-Soviet Union. I mean, they have such rich, porcelain and ceramics. And anyway, so apart from that, the story is as follows. So my grandfather's house, which is the last house that my family lived in Baghdad, is an Adamia, which is it's a neighborhood of Baghdad. And I mean, we knew that this house became after the when the family had to leave, etc., eventually became part of the Indian embassy complex. So the Indian embassy was renting it. And so when I first went into this house, which was in May or 2003, first of all, I as a child, you imagine something huge, you hear everything is bigger in your mind. And I went into this very large house, but it just was very different to my imagination. And it was extremely dirty, very dusty. It was still under the, it was part of still the Indian embassy. I mean, there was nothing left because they'd evacuated. I mean, the only thing left was some remnants, ironically, of a decoration that probably was part of a Diwali festival that they had. So on the floor you had this bright pinks and oranges and greens, like paper, and then you go down to the basement, it's sort of the ground floor, but it's sort of on the garden level, and you enter this world of these kitchens that literally are from, I don't think they changed a thing, from the 1950s. So it's this sort of, uber modern American kitchen that you see in these pictures with whatever Life magazine back in the, some housewife coming out with a roast chicken from the oven, and everything is very round, and the only thing there, and I'm not joking, was a teapot sitting on one of the counters. And the person who was with me, was been working with my father for a very long time, and is really part of the family, and he himself is Turkmen from Kirkuk, basically grabbed this teapot, and before I could say stop, he dropped it. So the teapot broke.
Oh.
So it was late for tea. I mean, literally
late for tea.
Yeah.
You touched upon this question of identity earlier on, and that writing the book has helped you come to terms somehow to understand your Iraqi side, to really immerse yourself into it. There was one moving scene in the book, I think in the first half of the book, I would say, where you say something like you're sitting in a cafe or restaurant in Beirut, and so far, you've been in your head, you're happily Lebanese, you're growing up in Beirut, you don't want to think too much about your Iraqi heritage, Iraqi side. And then you have Ilham al-Madfa'i, who's an Iraqi guitarist, who sings traditional Iraqi songs, who's there. And I think he was singing Fog al-Nakhal, or one of his main songs, and you felt very moved, and you felt a certain sense of nostalgia to an Iraq that you haven't known, that you have only known through the tales and stories told by your family. Was that a turning point for you?
It wasn't a turning point as much as I just kind of I didn't expect to have that kind of reaction in Beirut, which is also my home, and it just was so, it just reminded me of my grandparents, this language, my childhood, things that just were not there anymore, simply also because my grandparents have passed and at the time. And I think when you feel a lot of nostalgia, it's often it's a lot probably more personal. It's more egocentric than one probably admits,
Yeah.
And so in a sense, it was not a turning point per se, but it made me discover Ilham al-Madfa'i, which is think one of the greatest things that happened. I mean, I think he's fantastic. I love all his work, and I love how he's really adapted it also to kind of a new rhythm. I like that he, explored, and I find that also innovation to be a very wonderful thing, and I think this is what also is is I think a strength in Iraq, in the way that people adapt and innovate. I mean, or at least has been in the past, if you like. And so that was the story. Yeah.
Tamara, there are a lot of female figures in Late for Tea at the Deer Palace. Who to you, from the book or from outside of the book, a female figure that was inspiring to you personally?
Yeah, I'm sorry to sound very political, but probably there's two women that I think have been unbelievable in what they've achieved. One is Hannah Arendt, who is a philosopher and political writer, and who's, for me, the most important book that was ever written in the last 100 years was The Origins of Totalitarianism, and was a book that I really got to know well. I find her so inspirational, and I admire her courage tremendously, her intellectual courage, and the clarity of her thought, but also her I think profound belief in the human condition, which I think is very precious. The other woman that I think is amazing, and I mean, I would not have wanted to be her necessarily. She was very tortured, but I think she's incredible, is Louise Bourgeois, who's a very, very important woman artist, and who only became prominent in her, as it happens with women in her 80s. And I think her somehow the way that she was able to sublimate her anger, her pain, her trauma, her passion into her work, and communicate all of those things in her sculptures and her textiles is to me incredible. I mean, that clarity of vision, to be able to execute a work visually, an artwork, that is on the one hand can be incredibly simple, but is just so hauntingly powerful, is, I think, brilliant.
Tamara, your father, Ahmed Chalabi, can be described as a controversial political figure in the Middle East and in Iraq. Who was he to you, and what did his legacy mean to you?
So he was my father. He was my mentor. He was my hero. He was my teacher, my first teacher, and the best teacher I've had. He was my dearest friend. So from my point of view, I had a wonderful father, and I miss him every day. Yes, he was controversial. I mean, he was an unusual character. I think he was singular. He was, but I think he was also very much scapegoated. He was. There were lots of. He was a very easy figure to pin things on, because maybe his character allowed it. I admire his courage. I admire his belief. I admire his intellect. I think he's probably more controversial he was made to be controversial in the West. He was a very easy, I think, target. I mean, he was not the only person who was involved in the Iraqi opposition, and yet you only hear of his name, and everyone else seems to have gotten off the hook, in a sense, if you like, that there was a hook to begin with. And it's a very interesting kind of reverse racism that's involved, because this was a man who was extremely intelligent, extremely educated, was very fluent in the language of the West, but in the structure of how Western society, or at least certainly let's talk about American politics, worked. And I think there was a profound resentment, particularly among liberals, which is something that is a curious thing, who just really disliked someone who maybe sounded like them and talked like them, and who was maybe as smart, if not smarter than them. I think there's something really there that we still have to get dig into, not exclusively with just my father, but with a lot of people today, and who is deemed to be good and authentic, and who is deemed to be inauthentic, and unrepresentative. I think that this is a continuous issue that we have at a larger level, in terms of, and certainly with people who go into exile, people who are away from their homes, but who are also part of their homes. What makes you a real Iraqi versus, a not real Iraqi, or what makes you a good citizen of a place, or a good community member, if you don't follow the stereotypes of, let's say, are you a good Muslim if you don't cover up as a woman? From all of these points of view, I think yes, my father was controversial. I think also my father spoke in a way that wasn't necessarily very typical. He spoke how he thought, and maybe that's not a good thing in the Arab world in general, I've noticed. And he had a mission, he had a cause, he was very driven. So that's how I would put it. He put, I would say, his money where his mouth was. My father, went back to Iraq in 2003, and he never left, and he died in his family home, and he stuck it out, the good, the bad. He was, I think, betrayed very much by his own community, and here I talk about the Shia. But he also he faced up to his choices. He didn't suddenly pack up and go and hang out in the south of France.
Tamara, do you think we are misunderstood by the West, perhaps on purpose?
Oh, completely. I don't know that it's on purpose. I think we're misunderstood. I think we're misunderstood also by ourselves. I think it's about knowing thyself. And I think when I look at Iraqis today, it's also about, again, what makes a good Iraqi. I'll give you an amusing example, which, to me at the time, I was incensed. There was nothing amusing about it. But it was, I think, around 2009. And I arrived home, to my father's house, and there was lots of big political meeting, and obviously these things always predominantly are men, without exception, mostly. And so anyway, I arrived, and my dad was excited. Like, he came out to greet me, and he was very, happy to see me. I hadn't seen him in a while, and he just sort of put his arm around me and took me into the big, the meeting room, and said, "I want to introduce you to my daughter. This is my daughter, Dr. Tamara Chalabi." And he was proud of my, at least, academic achievement. And I also found it like very infantilizing, and it really annoyed me. But and there were all these, men sitting there from like different like areas of Baghdad, and different, like, and different, like, socioeconomic backgrounds and so on. And this Sheikh stands up in the middle of this like introduction in front of my father in his house, the young guy, and he says, "Do you call yourself Iraqi? أنت تسمين نفسك عراقية?" And I just looked at him, and I said, "عفواً." I didn't know, excuse me. And he says, إذا أنت صدق عراقية كنت لابسة عباية.
Oh.
And which means if you're really Iraqi, you'd have been wearing a abaya. And I looked at him and I said, إذا هاي العراقية خلي لك إياها، أنت خلي لك العباية إلك. And I left the room because
Which
I thought,
basically means, if this is your understanding of what an Iraqi woman
just
is,
you wear the abaya, you
go
keep
ahead and
it,
wear it.
to hell with you, sort of thing. And I walked out, and of course, I don't think anyone's ever said that to him, but I'm like, this entitlement, how dare you come and talk to me like this as a guest in my father's house? Yeah. And of course, it was all about scoring with these other guys. And so what I'm saying is about the understanding, or the intentional misunderstanding. I think we also don't know what we are. We're very confused. Maybe you and I are maybe less confused, or I don't know. But I think, and it's because it's connected to also, we go back to the idea of the preservation of heritage, of identity, of all the things that make up a place, a country, a people. All of these things have been violated.
Tamara, I cannot, we have to speak about Ruya Foundation. We have to. So What was the idea behind it? How did the idea come about?
Well, it came about actually because there was an effort in 2011, and there was an Iraq pavilion in Venice that was organized by various people, including two of the founders of co-founders of Ruya Foundation, Reem Shadar Kubba and Shwan Taha. And so when 2013 came about, there was a big problem of who had ownership or custodianship of this pavilion. And there was a fear and a concern that, again, because of corruption, because of rubbish, that the commissionship was going to be given to somebody even not connected to Iraq. And that was, so there was almost like this sense of panic that we wanted to salvage at least. And it felt like we were being even robbed of this cultural identity. And so that's when we decided to create Ruya Foundation as an Iraqi registered NGO, and to basically focus on contemporary art and on bridging, if you like, that gap between Iraq and the world and the world and Iraq. And I mean, the gap is still there. I mean, even though there is more easier access to Iraq today, but it's a very long-winded story, and we've done many things. I would say the most prominent project we've done internationally has been the Iraq Pavilion at the Venice Biennale since 2013. So it's been 4 editions, and each time it's about 7 months. And that's the length of the duration of the Art Biennale. It's been an extremely important project because it is a national representation, and so at least to get that right and to put Iraq on a cultural map, or reintroduce it, if you like, in a way that is also in tandem with how contemporary art functions in the world today, how these conversations are in the world at large. There is no point in doing something that cannot converse with the other. And I think this is part of the big challenge with Iraq today, is this kind of like, it's very inward in terms of its references. I mean, that very few are still able to connect with the outside world. And that connection isn't just by, wearing Western clothes or I mean, I'm talking about a much more kind of essential connection. I mean, which is really, in my mind, very much linked to education and the lack of it. I mean, it's happening slowly. It's much slower than I would have hoped. But I mean, it's also that the state is still lagging behind, because it still carries a lot of the bad elements of the previous regimes, on top of corruption, on top of everything else that's like, come about. So this is why Ruya was created, was to basically try to create, to be able to at least trigger some change and have some influence as far as how artists and how contemporary art is thought about, and it's kind of an informal way of trying to educate people and this community, if you like, and to be able to create this conversation with the international world that is more authentic and has agency again, so that it's Iraqis speaking. It's not somebody speaking for us on our behalf, and it's how communicating the various things that are Iraq today. So there's no whitewashing. It is. I mean, so the artists that we, I mean, the selection processes and the curation and so on, it's all connected to the material, and nobody's making anything up. It's
And Tamara, if I got it right, the foundation also looks at supporting Iraqi artists.
Yes, of course. I mean, but we have supported many Iraqi artists. We've helped people, even recently go to, be able to study abroad. We support a lot of projects, and we have done more so in the past because we've had more funding in the past. but at the same time, that support is not, it's conditional on obviously having a good proposal, it is within a context, and this is something very important, but also I think very frustrating for quite a few artists, because again, it's like you need a system, you need a syllabus, you need a level of a criteria to be able to then support, to have an idea that actually carries through as an artist, and we help a lot with that, we guide a lot, but at the same time, it's I think it's been frustrating for some artists because we don't accept anything
Of
as,
course.
yeah.
Tamara, what would you say is your proudest achievement?
Oh gosh.
Your proudest achievement, and would you still want to achieve?
I don't know if there's one singular moment. I think that the 2017 Iraq Pavilion was a labor of love for me, and the fact that I commissioned it, but also I was, the idea, the curation was mine. It was co-curated, but the genesis of the story was mine, and it was all based around objects from the Iraq Museum, and so the whole show was built around that, and all the artists commissioned to do work were commissioned to do work in relation to those objects, and getting these objects out of Iraq legally for the first time since 1977, when they would last when objects went to a museum abroad, was it was the most excruciatingly painful year of my life as far as negotiating, and this is a national pavilion, it's not, so it's part of the government, it's a national representation, and the way that the different anyway, it was very, very painful, and so getting it and realizing it was incredibly, I was very, very proud, and the exhibition itself was so beautiful, and so challenging to do, and so beautifully presented, and the feedback was amazing from everybody. We got the most wonderful write-ups, and New York Times, Financial Times, all of the press, and what we achieved with that was I was very, very proud of that. There are many moments that I would say I was very proud of. There was not a singular moment. There's a few things that I would say I was extremely proud of.
And
This was one of them. I'm just being brief.
That's the kind of Iraq that we want to see more of. That's the positive Iraq of culture, of artists. So it's truly amazing. Tamara, this is a question I ask all of my guests, and it's my personal favorite. If you saw your younger self today, what would you tell her?
I would tell her to be more confident, to be less afraid. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Tamara, it was wonderful talking to you today. For me,
Thank you for
it's
having
always
me.
such a pleasure for me to read a book and then get to speak to the author. This is the second time I got to do it for the Silk Narratives, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.